Let me go ahead and we'll go ahead and get started here. I want to introduce Kevin, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for quite some time, talking about Civil War stuff, but mostly Bristow Station. Kevin is the site manager of the Bristow Station battlefield near Manassas, Virginia. He was previously the director of education at the Mosby Hereditary Association, also out in horse country and Northern Virginia, so Virginia's pretty scenery. He sits on the board of directors of the Shepherdstown Battlefield Preservation Association and the Save Historic Antietam Foundation. Kevin also serves on the advisory board at Shenandoah University's McCormick Civil War Institute and Shepherd University's George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. His previous publications include Shepherdstown in the Civil War, One Vast Confederate Hospital, and Ohio at Antietam, the Buckeye State Sacrifice on America's Bloodiest Day. So that just came out recently. He is a graduate of Shepherd University, where he received his Bachelor of Arts in History with a concentration in Civil War and 19th century America. So welcome, Kevin. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for tuning in.
Good. Yeah, we're gonna have a fun time tonight talking about Antietam. And let's go ahead now, Jen, and pull up the slideshow and get started on kind of one of the first questions. We've got several questions that Kevin's going to talk about. And as we're looking at this, the first area that I wanted to ask you about is about the book itself. And I wanted to add, and by book, I mean the To Hazard All, the Guide to the Maryland Campaign. So the book is about more than just a battle of Antietam. Can you describe how the book is structured and what it covers?
Absolutely, yeah. It's even more than, I would say probably over 90% of the book is not about the Battle of Antietam. Instead, it is about the Maryland campaign, of which the Battle of Antietam is, some would argue, the climactic event of that campaign itself. But what Rob and I wanted to do was to get folks not just sitting in chairs at home reading about the Maryland campaign, but also create a tour guide to sites related to the campaign. So we have 5 chapters beyond a summary chapter about the Battle of Antietam. And the first chapter traces the route of the Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, from the Battle of Second Manassas up to Frederick. So that would be late August through about September 9th, 1862. Another chapter traces the Union Army, predominantly the Army of the Potomac under George McClellan, from Second Manassas through Washington, D.C. and out to Frederick. So from, again, late August to about September 12th of 1862. And then we have chapters covering the Confederate advance routes on Harper's Ferry and the Battle of Harper's Ferry itself, fought from September 12th to the 15th. And then another chapter covers the 3 main passes that were a part of the Battle of South Mountain on September 14th. So we cover some of the Union advance routes to South Mountain and then the fighting at South Mountain itself. Then, as I mentioned, there's a brief summary chapter about the Battle of Antietam, because you really can't have a book about the Maryland campaign without at least mentioning something about Antietam. And then the final chapter was something that we thought was a little bit different, because most histories of the Maryland campaign have the campaign coming to an end September 17th or even September 18th. We wanted to take the campaign a little bit further than that. So we do trace the Army's steps away from Sharpsburg and away from the Antietam battlefield to the Potomac River at Shepherdstown, where the last engagement of the Maryland campaign took place on September 19th and 20th. And then even beyond that as well, we extended the last chapter through the 6-week reorganizations of the both respective armies, the Army of Northern Virginia in Virginia and the Army of the Potomac in predominantly Maryland, north of the Potomac River. But the final stop takes you all the way down to where George McClellan received his orders that he was no longer in command of the Army of the Potomac, was relieved by Ambrose Burnside, and then where McClellan said his farewell to the Army in November 1862. So that's very much a time period that gets overshadowed by the events of the Maryland campaign before it and the events of the Fredericksburg campaign after it. So the book is meant to get you out to see some of these sites, because really, I mean, a lot of the sites related to the Maryland campaign are well preserved and do not appear to be all that different from what soldiers might have seen them as in September 1862.
Okay, thanks for the overview. Let's go into a few questions about the campaign and the battle. Jen, let's move to the next slide if we could, please. And so a couple of questions here, Kevin. On Lee's, after the Battle of Second Manassas in late August 1862, Lee moved into Maryland in early September. What were Lee's campaign? What was Lee's campaign objective? Was this a raid? Was this an attempt to conquer cities, or what was he up to?
There were quite a few things that Lee was up to, and when I say Lee as well, I will preface that by saying there are certain objectives of this campaign that perhaps Robert E. Lee did not seem to think were realistic, but they were nonetheless war aims of the Confederate government. And so by moving into Maryland, Lee was carrying out those war aims, chief among which is, of course, Confederate independence. At this point in the war, a year and a half into the Civil War, it pretty much seems like everybody on both sides almost universally agreed that if one more Confederate victory could be had, especially in the eastern theater of the war and especially north of the Potomac River, that this war might come to an end and Confederate independence might finally be recognized. If it's not recognized by the United States of America and the Lincoln administration, then at the very least, it might be enough to convince Britain and France to come in and diplomatically recognize the Confederacy, which was another objective that maybe if not Robert E. Lee was thinking about, certainly the Confederate government was, and I will add Britain's government was thinking about it as well. The Prime Minister of Great Britain, Palmerston, literally held a meeting with his cabinet on September 17th, 1862, saying we must strike while the iron is hot, indicating that if there's any time that we're going to jump in to this conflict and mediate and recognize the Confederacy, now is the time to do it. Another aim of the campaign was to bring, or at least give, Marylanders an opportunity to join the Confederate cause. And if hopefully for the Confederate Congress, they hoped that they could get more than just Marylanders into the Confederate cause, but get Maryland itself as a state of the Confederacy. Lee also hoped to be able to influence midterm elections that were about to be taking place about a month from the time of his crossing of the Potomac River in northern states, hoping to damage the Union war effort by getting more Democrats into Congress and limiting Lincoln's war ultimately. Lee also hoped to get the war out of Virginia, give Virginia farmers time to rest, replant their crops, harvest their crops, and live off the land in Maryland. All of those are absolutely true, but I think one thing that's very telling to me is what Robert E. Lee said in an interview after the war. He said, "I went into Maryland to give battle." And not just to give battle. Lee was not in the business of fighting battles for the sake of just fighting a battle. Lee went into Maryland to fight and win a battle. And that was his main objective. If he could do that, all of those other things that I talked about, midterm elections, perhaps foreign recognition, Confederate independence, everything else might fall into place for Lee. So that's Lee's main task, is to move north of the Potomac River, draw the Union, and then find a good place where Lee can bring it to battle and defeat it, whether that's in Maryland or in Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now on the other side of the equation is General McClellan, George B. McClellan, who had brought his Army of the Potomac as the commander down to the Virginia Peninsula. They fought the 7 days battles, was unsuccessful in taking Richmond, was forced eventually to reposition his troops or change his base or retreat over to the James River. Lincoln finally ordered him out of there, and a second smaller army was formed in northern Virginia under General John Pope, defeated at Second Manassas pretty soundly. And somehow McClellan got back into command of all the troops that were going to be defending Washington, chasing Lee, and trying to defeat him. How did that happen? How did he get back into the command of the Union Army of the Potomac?
Not easily. And McClellan was always in command of the Army of the Potomac. What Lincoln was really doing, and by extension to General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, is Lincoln was playing a dangerous political game trying to get rid of McClellan before the midterm elections. Because, of course, Lincoln is a Republican, McClellan was a war Democrat, and Lincoln wanted to have the support of not only Republicans, but Democrats as well for the Union war effort. And having McClellan, a war Democrat again, in charge of the main field army of the United States, Lincoln hoped might garner some support from war Democrats. But to fire him outright, in Lincoln's relationship and McClellan's relationship with Lincoln, conversely, was not good, as you indicated, John, in the summer of 1862. And so what the policy was is really by removing McClellan's army from the Virginia Peninsula and bringing it back to Northern Virginia was to essentially siphon the Army of the Potomac away from McClellan and not fire him outright, but basically take McClellan's command away from him and leave him as a major general in the United States Army, but he wouldn't be commanding much of anything. And so you see that as units are pulled off the Virginia Peninsula and they arrive in Northern Virginia, they're still technically a part of McClellan's Army of the Potomac, but because McClellan is not present with them in the field, they are under the direct command of John Pope of the Army of Virginia, who is very much the antithesis, as far as the Union war effort was concerned, of George McClellan. Of course, Pope does not work out, put it shortly and bluntly, losing at the Battle of Second Manassas. And as Pope falls back, there is a exchange of dispatches that indicate very clearly from Pope's perspective that he does not believe he has the favor of some of the Army of the Potomac officers that were fighting with him in the Army of Virginia, nor did Pope have the favor of a lot of the men that were under his command. And Lincoln felt, really, in terms of all of those forces coming into Washington, not just the Army of the Potomac and John Pope's Army of Virginia defeated at Second Manassas, portions of different divisions from Western Virginia, North and South Carolina, and a host of newly raised troops that were joining the United States Army at this point. Lincoln felt there was nobody that could really make an army, a field army, out of all of those combined troops than George McClellan. And Lincoln said something to the effect of, paraphrasing a little bit, but he did say, he believed McClellan had acted badly, but he also believed he had nobody else to turn to, that McClellan had the army with him. And that really mattered because Lincoln could not afford to let a Confederate army linger north of the Potomac River. And he needed an army in the field quickly to try and drive the Confederates out of Maryland. So even before the Confederate army entered Maryland, Lincoln turned to McClellan, at least giving him command of the forces within Washington. And then eventually that command grew to McClellan commanding the field army that by name was the Army of the Potomac, though on paper it was more than just the Army of the Potomac. But that is Lincoln's hand was almost forced. He felt he had no other option, nobody else to turn to besides George McClellan.
So you mentioned in your response that Lincoln was trying to get rid of McClellan. That doesn't sound like a happy, healthy relationship between president and major general. Can you tell us about Lincoln's relationship with McClellan and how that was panning out around this time?
Not good, and it takes two sides, two people to make a relationship, and neither one was really invested, I think, wholly in the relationship. McClellan and Lincoln did not agree politically on the aims of the war. Of course, by this point, the Union war effort was drifting more towards a harder war that was affecting not only Confederate armies in the field, but civilians at home, and was beginning to, even though the Emancipation Proclamation wouldn't be issued or announced until after the Battle of Antietam and the Maryland campaign came to an end, it was pretty evident that the war was drifting in that direction. And McClellan asked Lincoln's permission in late June 1862 to present his views to the president on the war. Lincoln agreed to it. McClellan didn't have time to do it until after the 7 days battles, but he presented it, his views in a letter to Lincoln that has become known as the Harrison's Landing Letter, written July 7th of 1862, in which McClellan outlined his views for a more conciliatory, a less of a softer war, if you will, than as compared to the harder hand of war that was being talked about at that point by John Pope as he took command in Northern Virginia. Both men, by the start of the Maryland campaign, felt that the other had done them wrong. Lincoln believed that, again, as I mentioned earlier, he said to one of his aides that McClellan has acted badly towards Pope, and Lincoln believed that was unforgivable. McClellan believed that Lincoln had acted badly towards him for his army to remain on the Virginia Peninsula to attack Richmond, and instead Lincoln had decided to pull the army off of the Virginia Peninsula. And there's a whole other slew of disagreements between the two, dating back, at least related to the Peninsula campaign, to the spring of 1862, that really stuck with war Democrats in terms of blaming Lincoln and the Lincoln administration for the failure of McClellan to take Richmond in the summer of 1862. By extension, too, Lincoln's relationship, I think, was better with McClellan than Lincoln's cabinet was. In fact, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, just prior to the Maryland campaign, actually circulated a petition behind Lincoln's back amongst Lincoln's cabinet members that essentially said if McClellan is put back in command of his field army, that they would resign and essentially dissolve the Lincoln administration. Stanton presented that to Lincoln at a September 2nd cabinet meeting, but by that point, Lincoln had already made up his mind. And so you really get a sense that boss and subordinate are not working all that well together, are not seeing eye to eye, and that's something that's going to have troubles as the campaign played out.
Well, let's talk about one of the most talked about aspects of the campaign. And Jen, if we can go to the next slide, and that is the matter of the so-called lost order. And this seems to be known by just about anybody who's read anything on the Eastern Theater of the War. Here we have a view from Monocacy Battlefield, and this is just south of Frederick, Maryland, for folks who haven't been there. But Kevin, this is where historians think the lost order was found. Isn't that correct?
Correct. Yeah, this is the Best Farm, basically right across the street from the Monocacy National Battlefield Visitor Center today.
Okay.
I
have a few questions about it. Let's move on to the next screen. I just want to show people the battlefield there, and let's go to the middle one first right away. So tell us a little bit about the lost order, what it was, and really to kind of answer your opinion on, was this really the key to defeating Lee? Because so many historians, and you can talk about that if you'd like to, so many books and even recent ones have really focused in on this as if it were the one team getting the other team's playbook on the eve of the Super Bowl or something. So tell us about the lost order.
Yeah, so just to provide a broader background, I think everybody knows the lost order by name, but probably a lot of folks don't know it by its official name, which is Special Orders Number 191, which was an operational plan, an operational order that Robert E. Lee had dictated and sent out to his subordinate officers on September 9th, 1862. And essentially what 191 called for was the division of Lee's army into 4 different columns. 3 of the 4 columns would converge on the Shenandoah Valley and eliminate 2 Union garrisons there in the valley, one at Martinsburg and one at Harper's Ferry. And eventually the 2 garrisons joined together at Harper's Ferry, and this is what led to the Battle of Harper's Ferry. But Lee believed he had to eliminate Harper's Ferry because the Shenandoah Valley was his supply line back to Virginia to not only bring food to his army, but also to bring ammunition to his army. And again, if Lee's going to fight a battle in Maryland or Pennsylvania, he's going to need that supply line. So Lee issues Special Orders Number 191, as I said, on September 9th. It went into effect the next day, September 10th, and Lee's army began to divide. Now, Lee called for a very strict timetable when it came to dividing his army and then reuniting his army. In fact, he thought it would only take about 3 days to eliminate the Union garrisons in the Shenandoah Valley, so that somewhere in the ballpark of September 12th, September 13th, Lee hoped that his army and planned on his army being in a position to reunite. and somewhere in the area of Sharpsburg or Hagerstown, and then probably move north into Pennsylvania. By September 13th, the day that the lost orders comes into McClellan's hands, Lee's army is still not in a position to be reunited. In fact, the Battle of Harper's Ferry is really just beginning. Now, coming out of, on the flip side, for the Union side, George McClellan's perspective, coming out of Washington, there was a lot of confusion about exactly what this Confederate movement into Maryland meant. Some folks, including General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, believed that this was all a ruse on the part of the Confederate Army, that they were trying to draw most of the Union Army northwest of Washington into Maryland. And once they had done that, they would recross the Potomac River and strike the soft southern underbelly of Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, and take that. So as McClellan was trying to move his army out from Washington, Halleck was writing to him, telling him he was moving too quickly. But eventually McClellan gathered enough intelligence and was able to discern that intelligence and determine by September 11th, September 12th, even before he had the lost order, that Lee's army was moving away from Frederick. And the intelligence McClellan had indicated that it was moving in two different directions. One of those directions was towards Harper's Ferry. The other direction was in the area of Hagerstown and Williamsport. So what McClellan wasn't sure of, he at least was convinced that Lee's army was moving in two different directions, but he didn't know what that meant. Why was the enemy doing that in hostile country, as McClellan would have viewed it, at least the Confederates would have viewed it. And so the lost order, when it came into McClellan's hands in the early afternoon of September 13th, much later than many historians have given it credit for. I don't think McClellan gets his hands on the copy until the afternoon of September 13th, after it's passed up the chain of command from a couple of soldiers in the 27th Indiana, finding it in an abandoned Confederate encampment wrapped around a couple of cigars. They forwarded up the chain of command, and again, it gets to McClellan's hands by the afternoon of September 13th. Now, there were a few problems with the lost order when it came into McClellan's hands. The first thing is, this was not a unique occurrence in the Eastern Theater of the War. In fact, from August 18th to September 13th of 1862, the lost order was the fifth instance of an enemy order falling into enemy hands between the major Union and Confederate armies in the Eastern Theater of the War. So this is not some miraculous find. This is not anything new that took place. I think the reason it gets most of the attention is four of those other orders were captured. The lost order is literally just found in a field. And I think that uniqueness gives it some legs as far as historians are concerned. But when the lost order is given to McClellan, it has been verified at this point by some of the 12th Corps staff officers in McClellan's army as a genuine order. But it does have some problems. Firstly, each of the paragraphs in Special Orders number 191, at least the lost copy, which was addressed from Lee's headquarters to Confederate Division Commander Daniel Harvey Hill, each of those paragraphs were numbered. And if you look at a copy of the lost orders today, it's still in McClellan's papers in the Library of Congress. The first paragraph is paragraph number 3. Now, I don't know of anybody that went to school that learned to count and learned starting to count with 3. So what's in paragraphs 1 and 2? Today, we know from other copies of Special Orders 191, we know that it really had nothing to do with Lee's operational plan in Maryland, but there was no way for McClellan to figure that out. So what were the other two pieces? What was missing from these lost orders? Additionally, reading the lost orders, Hagerstown was only mentioned twice in 10 paragraphs, well, in 8 paragraphs of text, and McClellan had positive information that part of the enemy army was in Hagerstown. So did this indicate that Lee was deviating from 191? And if so, how much had he deviated from it? How much had changed? The other thing, again, as I mentioned, is Lee laid out in 191 that his army would be in a position to reunite by September 12th. When does McClellan get the order? September 13th, the day after Lee's army is supposed to be reunited, which would mean that McClellan is not moving towards a divided enemy army, but instead perhaps could be moving towards a reuniting enemy army. Also, another problem with the lost orders for McClellan is that it does not indicate any enemy strength. Instead, it lists different things like Longstreet's command, Jackson's command, Hill's command, McLaw's command. What are all of these commands? A command is not a formal army organization like a brigade, division, corps, etc. So what does each of these commands consist of? So it doesn't help McClellan determine the size of the enemy army. That said, though, I do believe that the lost order coming into McClellan's hands does have one implication for McClellan in the campaign. Once it is verified, by the way, he does have to send his cavalry out to verify it. But what it does for McClellan is it at least confirms in his mind, or at least it tells him why the enemy army has moved in two different directions, towards Williamsport and towards Harper's Ferry, which was the thing that was really plaguing him all along. Again, he knew the Confederate Army was moving in those two different directions. He just didn't know what the purpose of all of that was. And so finally, with the lost orders in his hands, McClellan does finally have that answer. About 3 p.m., a little after 3 p.m., McClellan sends his cavalry chief, Alfred Pleasonton, this is on the afternoon of September 13th, to go and verify that Lee's army is still divided. It takes Pleasonton a couple of hours. Pleasonton doesn't have drones or satellites or anything like that to verify all this. When he tells McClellan that the orders are genuine, Lee's army is still divided, then McClellan begins to dispatch his army towards the passes of South Mountain. Even before Pleasonton had verified 191 in the lost orders, McClellan began moving portions of his army in the direction of South Mountain. 35 minutes after he wrote to Pleasonton at 3 p.m. at 3:35, he began moving portions of the Union 9th Corps west from Frederick towards the passes of South Mountain. He then settled on a plan about 6:30 the afternoon of the 13th that would move the main body of his army towards what he believed to be the main body of the Confederate Army in Turner's Gap around the town of Boonesboro today, while he sent the Union 6th Corps under the command of William Franklin to relieve the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry. So McClellan had that plan settled upon. Now, most of his army did not move until the morning, early on the morning of September 14th. That is not true for all of his army, though. McClellan put most of the 9th Corps right at the base of South Mountain, the town of Middletown, about 3 or 4 miles east of South Mountain, so within easy marching distance. And some of those 9th Corps troops did not settle into their bivouacs in Middletown until midnight or shortly after on the morning of September 14th. So McClellan was using night marches to get his command in position come the morning of September 14th for what would become known as the Battle of South Mountain.
So, Kevin, there's been some recent work out there from historians and writers who have placed much heavier emphasis on South Mountain than has previously been done. I mean, and when I say previously, I mean even into the 90s and early 2000s. South Mountain seems like it's some kind of warm-up act to Antietam, and that really it was not. It was just McClellan pushing through the mountains, but you know, there were a lot of troops involved here, and it really altered Lee's planning and thinking and actions. So what do you think of the Battle of South Mountain as far as the emphasis on it and what its real importance was?
Yeah, so historians, as you mentioned, and correctly so, have not really given South Mountain its fair shake, but you're right, it is a sizable battle, fought over 7 miles of South Mountain in Maryland at 3 main mountain passes, but there are a few other smaller passes that are part of the battle. But overall, it's about 50,000 men that are involved in the fighting, and during the day on September 14th, it's about 5,000 casualties between both armies. So it is definitely a sizable battle. That's about the size of the Battle of First Manassas, and at least in terms of the casualties that occurred on September 14th. So it is certainly a crucial piece of the campaign. Robert E. Lee decided he was in Hagerstown at that point, to move 2 divisions of James Longstreet's command from Hagerstown back down to Boonesboro to support D.H. Hill's division guarding Turner's Gap, which was the main pass through South Mountain where the National Road passed over the mountain itself. And so Lee decided that rather than abandoning, he was caught quite off guard by McClellan's movements up to this point in the campaign. As Lee put it, he said, the enemy moved more rapidly than was convenient for our purposes, which is a pretty nice way of saying Lee was shocked and surprised that the Union Army was that close to him. So Lee decided to, rather than breaking up the siege of Harper's Ferry, Lee decided to move Longstreet's divisions down to South Mountain and defend the mountain pass to try and buy time for Stonewall Jackson at Harper's Ferry to wrap up the operations there. So Lee was fighting to buy time. By the end of the day of September 14th, we don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty of the battle itself, but fought over a very, very tremendously difficult terrain. If you've never been up to South Mountain, I would highly suggest it. And walk some of that ground. It is some of perhaps the hardest ground that soldiers would ever fight in during the course of the Civil War. But McClellan's army is able to take the three main passes where there was fighting: Turner's Gap, Fox's Gap, and Crampton's Gap. At least not take them, but make those passes untenable for Lee's army to hold on to the next day. And so what Lee decided on the night of September 14th was to abandon his campaign into Maryland, to bring his army by way of Sharpsburg across the Potomac River back into Virginia, and let most of his army would have been on the south side of the Potomac at that point anyway, at Harper's Ferry. But he told Lafayette McLaws, whose command was still in Maryland, that was defending the northern approaches to Harper's Ferry, he said, the day has gone against us. And again, he told McLaws, basically, figure out any way you possibly can to get out of Maryland and back into Virginia. And so it did seem for a time that for about 12 hours, South Mountain was the decisive battle of the Maryland campaign, until the morning of September 15th, when Robert E. Lee arrived on the heights east of Antietam Creek, outside of Sharpsburg, Maryland. He got a look at the terrain on the west side of the creek. And he also received word that from Jackson that the garrison at Harper's Ferry was about to surrender. And so Lee decided to try and buy time for his army to reunite there at Sharpsburg and resurrect his campaign. So South Mountain did fade in the background of the larger Battle of Antietam because of that decision by Lee. Now, what South Mountain did do, if I can just say real quickly, is James Longstreet talked about how it wrecked the morale of the Army of Northern Virginia. Not so much wrecked the morale, but really took the morale of the Army of Northern Virginia took a big hit following its defeat at South Mountain. It was really the first defeat that the Confederate Army had to retreat from the battlefield. And for the Army of the Potomac, a lot of the soldiers talked about that this was the first time they'd really driven the enemy from the battlefield. They had now been left to see the aftermath of battle. And though it was a terrible sight to see that and to witness that, they now had beaten Lee. They had done something they had not been able to do yet. They had beaten Lee, and Lee's army was running back to the Potomac River. So it really boosted the morale of the Army of the Potomac.
Well, let's go to our next slide, because this kind of ties in with what you were just getting at, is Lee's handling the campaign. And here are some questions here, and you can answer all or some of them, or however you want to do this. But what was the plan to invade Maryland too ambitious, especially with the numbers that he brought across the Potomac? They were widely dispersed. The troops, were they too widely dispersed? And you mentioned the surrender at Harper's Ferry. Some historians have said that maybe Lee should have ignored the garrison at Harper's Ferry. What are your thoughts on some of these issues?
So I'll just go ahead and knock them down one bullet point at a time. Was the plan too ambitious? Perhaps. Lee's army was really at the end of its rope, physically speaking. Just as a point of example, Lee's army, when it moved into Maryland in early September 1862, probably totaled about 70,000 men. When Lee fought the Battle of Antietam 2 weeks after moving into Maryland, his army was less than 40,000 men. And that 30,000 men difference was not soldiers lost in combat. In most cases, it was soldiers that had just been pushed to the limits of human exertion and just fell out along the wayside. Straggling was an immense problem for Lee's army and for the Army of the Potomac too in this campaign. But I think also looking at it from Lee's perspective, Lee felt there was no other option at that point. He did theoretically have a few options after Second Manassas. He could have attacked Washington, but he believed it was too heavily fortified and his army was not in a position to take it. Lee could also pull back into the Shenandoah Valley, but he felt by doing that, that would give the Federals more time to restore their army, restore their confidence. Or Lee could pull back closer to his own supply base at Richmond, but that would give up all of the ground that he had just won in central and northern Virginia in the summer of 1862. So Lee felt that he had no other option by crossing the Potomac River and moving into Maryland. Lee said something to the effect after the war, again, paraphrasing a little bit, in relation to the Gettysburg campaign, but somebody said, said to him that you took great risks. And Lee said, that's what our war was about, was taking risks. We had to, because that's what Lee felt was the only way to win the war, was to take risks and try to convince the Northern public that this was not a war that the United States could win. And so Lee, regardless of I think the plan may be, looking at it as a sitting here in my house 160 years later, perhaps it probably was a bit too ambitious, but Lee felt at the time he had no other option. Now, were the Confederates too widely dispersed with Harper's Ferry, and should Lee have ignored the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry? Too widely dispersed, they were very widely dispersed, certainly. In fact, from Harper's Ferry to Hagerstown, Lee's army was divided when McClellan, the lost orders came into McClellan's hands. Lee's army was divided over 20 miles of countryside, and it was not only just divided by mileage, but it was divided by mountain ranges, in some cases nearly impassable mountain ranges, and rivers and streams as well. So there were actually portions of the Union Army that were closer to Lee's army than portions of Lee's army were to itself on September 13th and 14th. And so certainly that limited the potential of Lee trying to bring as many men into the fight as he possibly could because of that. Now, again, that was something that Lee felt he had to do because he felt he could not ignore the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry itself. He believed by crossing into Maryland and crossing where he did outside of Leesburg between Washington and Baltimore and Harper's Ferry, that by doing so and cutting off the Harper's Ferry and Martinsburg garrisons from Baltimore and Washington, that those garrisons would leave the valley and leave it wide open for Lee. Because again, Lee needed the Shenandoah Valley as his supply line. That didn't happen for a slew of reasons, namely General-in-Chief Henry Halleck ordered Dixon Miles, commanding the Harper's Ferry garrison, to hold the town at all hazards, and so Miles could not leave. But that was really what undid Lee's campaign. That's what undid Lee's plans. But Lee, again, felt he had to get rid of those Union garrisons in Martinsburg and Harper's Ferry, and if they weren't going to leave themselves, he had to force them to leave. Now, it is interesting to note, though, when Lee begins moving north into Maryland again in June of 1863, he did bypass Harper's Ferry. And rather than get sucked into another fight there and slowing him down, he just completely moved right past it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. All right, let's move to the next slide as we wind down here. Some myths about Antietam. I threw some of these up here. First, was McClellan too slow after South Mountain? What's your thing about that?
So the morning of September 15th, Union soldiers started creeping forward into the fog to develop if the Confederate Army was still atop South Mountain. Once they found out that they weren't, McClellan did begin to pursue them, first he had to figure out where they were going, send his cavalry forward, and did eventually figure out that Lee was beginning to stand behind Antietam Creek, or at least bring his army together behind Antietam Creek. If you've driven in what I would consider rush hour in Washington County, Maryland, which parts of Washington County are still very rural, and so rush hour might not be all that bad, but driving from South Mountain to Antietam, you have to travel the very same road network that both armies did to get from Turner's Gap to Sharpsburg, and there is one road that will take you there. And that's it. And when you think about the Army of the Potomac moving after Lee, it was just an immense traffic jam between Boonesboro and Sharpsburg. McClellan himself got to the front in the mid-afternoon of September 15th to survey the Confederate line, and I think he was a little bit surprised.
Folks, it looks like we're having a little bit of difficulty with Kevin's connection, so if you'll stand by, we're going to work on getting him back. So please bear
Got me
with.
now?
Yeah, we got you now. Good.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what's happening.
That's all right.
Joys of Zoom. Where'd you lose me?
I'm not sure, but I think what we, in order to wind down here and cover the last several slides, let's jump to your conclusions on McClellan's tactics at the battle. At first glance, he started out his attacks piecemeal by almost one corps at a time, moving from north to south. From your research and writing and familiarity with the battle, were McClellan's tactics flawed by not concentrating as much force as possible, or were these intentional?
So at the point of contact for each of the really five major parts of the Battle of Antietam: the cornfield fighting, the fighting in the West Woods, the sunken road action, the fighting at Burnside's Bridge, and what we call the final attack, which is the fighting west of Burnside's Bridge on the afternoon of September 17th. For those five places, McClellan brought more troops to the fight than Lee could. Now, some of that is the fact that McClellan did have more men, yes, but even then, you have to be able to bring more men to bear at certain points of a battlefield. That's what a commander is supposed to do, and McClellan did do that. However, there were a few handicaps that McClellan had to face when it came to pushing Lee from his position on the high ground outside of Sharpsburg. And one was, I think Lee selected his ground brilliantly. The three main approaches that McClellan's army could take across the upper bridge, the middle bridge, or the lower bridge that came to be known as Burnside's Bridge, in order to climb up from those places, Federal troops had to move upwards of 200 feet in elevation, climb it over 200 feet in elevation to get at Lee's line. And that's no small feat, certainly. They had just done that at South Mountain a few days earlier, done something greater than that. But any high ground defensive position is not easy to be driven from. The other thing is Lee positioned his troops so that McClellan could not get his entire army across Antietam Creek at once. Now, I view it as, you think about the Antietam battlefield, there were five major crossing points on the battlefield of Antietam Creek. The upper bridge, this is going from north to south, the upper bridge, Prize Ford, the middle bridge, the Burnside Bridge, and Snavely's Ford. At the beginning of the day, September 17th, McClellan only held three of those five crossing points in his possession. By the end of the day, he held all five. And what you see at the end of the day is no longer are Union Corps fighting by themselves, but instead what you have is almost the entire Union Army west of the Antietam Creek that runs in a line all the way from Burnside Bridge up to the North Woods, north of the cornfield, a distance of about 3 to 4 miles. And I think that's what McClellan was really trying to do, was bring his entire army to bear west of the Antietam Creek. And that was ultimately something that, once that happened, I think, in my opinion, Robert E. Lee had no other options in Maryland. He was in a no-win situation. He could not push McClellan's army back east across the Antietam Creek once the entire Army of the Potomac is west of the creek. And that's ultimately, in my mind, what drives Lee to make the decision to bring his army out of Maryland and back into Virginia. So I might have been getting a little bit ahead of myself with that.
Okay, we'll get to that. The last myth or story or fable, different ways to say it, is that at the closing hours of the battle, Burnside's attack on this village of Sharpsburg has been defeated by or pushed back, thrown back by A.P. Hill's arriving troops. And there's the story that goes that there was a limited number of troops that McClellan had available to him under the 5th Corps commander, Fitzjohn Porter, and it's been overly dramatized, of course, but the myth is that McClellan looked at Porter and said, "Hey, should I put your troops in to try to not only save Burnside but attack the center almost toward Sharpsburg?" And Porter said something along the lines of, "These are the last troops of the available," or something more dramatic about the Republic. And is there any truth to that story at all?
You're going to give me an hour to answer this one, right? um, in short, I don't think there's any truth to it. The story, like you recited, John, of Fitzjohn Porter or McClellan turning to Porter and Porter saying, "Remember, General, I am the last reserve of the last army of the Republic." That was all relayed by hearsay, and the person who promulgated the story after the Civil War did not hear it. He reported to have been told that that's what Porter said by someone who supposedly had heard it. So the only person that I've been able to find that was supposedly a part of that conversation that talked about it was Fitzjohn Porter himself, and he vehemently denied that conversation ever took place. Now, Porter, of course, is biased. He's not going to admit that he might have had that conversation, but there are other sources, including one Fifth Corps staff officer that really seems to put the kibosh on that story, that it did not happen. In reality, what McClellan had there in the center with Porter's troops was only about 4,000 men. And that's what Porter mentioned that in his after-action report, written just days after the battle, is really he did not have a huge force to throw forward in the center against the center of Lee's army. And this is a story that has really been twisted by a lot of historians. There's one book that takes a quote from 5th Corps Division Commander George Sykes, and Sykes says, or at least he's quoted by one author as having said, "If we had had more troops, or if McClellan had given us more troops, we could have crowned the Sharpsburg Heights." In reality, when you go back to Sykes's after-action report, he says, if there had been more troops available, if we had even had more troops in the area, we might have been able to do that. But that was a big if. And so I don't think that story did happen. It's a good story. Of course, certainly it's had a lot of legs
Sure.
as far as historians have used it, but I don't believe it happened.
All right, let's then go to the next slide here. Lee eventually, as you mentioned previously, decides to withdraw out of across the Potomac, and here we have a scene of Bottler's Ford, which is on the Potomac River, just downstream, not very far from Shepherdstown. What about McClellan's pursuit of Lee's army afterwards? Was it too cautious, or was he being prudent?
So to think about McClellan's pursuit of Lee's army, McClellan's mindset was simply that his army was in really bad shape and that he wanted to spend some time reorganizing his army. And so the immediate objective was simply get Lee out of Maryland and back into Virginia. And then McClellan wanted to take a few weeks after that to reorganize his army. So what ended up happening was as Lee pulled back across Boteler's Ford about a mile downstream from Shepherdstown back into Virginia, McClellan did send cavalry first and then eventually the Union Fifth Corps to pursue toward Shepherdstown. Both the cavalry commander, Alfred Pleasanton, and Fitzjohn Porter were ordered not to cross the river unless they saw that they could do damage to the enemy. By the evening of September 19th, Porter found an opportunity. He sent about 400 men across the river. They managed to scatter the Confederate rear guard, capture 4 artillery pieces, and then Porter sent a reconnaissance over the next day that was turned back by Lee's army because Lee had to turn his army back toward Shepherdstown to try and stop this Union threat in his rear. Ironically, the last battle of the Maryland campaign there at Shepherdstown, you could argue, was a Confederate victory. The Confederates held the field. Union troops certainly got the worst of the fighting. But after that, both Lee and McClellan went into a period of resting and reorganizing their armies and getting them ready for another campaign. So there was a pursuit to the Potomac River. It was certainly a limited pursuit, and McClellan did not push his command across the Potomac River. But at that point, he was really concerned about preventing Lee from coming back into Maryland. And so he was now dispersing his army, much like Lee had done, to cover the various crossing points back into Maryland.
So before we go to the last question that we'll throw at you, I want to let the audience know this is a great example of the value of Rob and Kevin's book, because this site is completely accessible to the public, and there's great signage there. You can go right down to the river. You can see where the artillery was that was captured, and this is just one of dozens and dozens of sites that the book has that allows you to see where these places are and where you can get to them. So it's a good example of that. Last question from the next slide, please, is the Battle of Antietam. We asked this question in the beginning: was it a draw or a Union victory? And in some ways, it seems odd that we even have to ask that question, but it's been very controversial, or at least disputed, for decades of historiography. What's your opinion on the question? But even further than that, why is this a question? Why is a question? Because you saw the poll, Kevin. 59% people said no, it was a victory, but 41% felt, this was not a Union victory. It was a draw. So what is the question here?
I think it was a Union victory, as I talked about tactically, because McClellan is able to. I think part of the reason Lee fights where he does at Antietam is he has the creek between himself and McClellan. Lee fights the whole campaign, whether it's mountain ranges or creeks or rivers, with a natural barrier between him and the enemy. Lee no longer has that after Antietam, and the gains that the Federal Army makes on September 17th, which truly in some places are only slight gains. I mean, on the Union right, the Confederate left, the Union Army gains about a mile of ground. Sunken Road, they gain a few hundred yards, which might not seem like all that much, but again, it puts enough of a strain on Lee's intentions and Lee's plans that Lee, in my opinion, is put in a no-win situation on the night of September 17th and on September 18th. And to me, if you're putting your opponent in a no-win situation, that's not a draw to me. Now, Lee does not withdraw from Antietam on the night of September 17th. Instead, he will stand his army at Sharpsburg on the 18th as well. And in the past, this has been viewed as Robert E. Lee is really making a stand, that he can read George McClellan's mind and knows that McClellan's not going to attack him the next day. Lee has no way of knowing that. And in reality, looking at the situation, Lee could not get his army off the field the night of September 17th. It was disorganized. It was strung out in a long 3-mile line. There were no plans or orders given for his commands to fall back across the Potomac River. I mean, it took Lee 3 days to get his army into Maryland. Who could think he could do it without any plans in half a night? That's very optimistic. So I think Lee's standing at Antietam on September 18th is really what lends, well, a lot of people argue would indicate that Antietam is a draw because of that. But I would turn to another battle that's fought in the North in July 1863 at Gettysburg. Following Pickett's charge on July 3rd, 1863, Lee's army doesn't withdraw entirely. It remains on the field on July 4th, but we have no problem calling Gettysburg a Union victory. But Antietam is considered a draw. I think is not giving enough credit to the Army of the Potomac in September 1863.
Sure. Okay, we got time for a couple of questions here. One question: had Lee been successful at Antietam, is there evidence that Britain and France would have thrown their support behind the Confederacy?
Yes. As I mentioned, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Viscount Palmerston, talked about, he held a meeting with his cabinet September 17th, 1862, the day the Battle of Antietam was being fought, saying that we're going to be monitoring this campaign northwest of Washington. If there's any time that we're going to come in and join the Confederacy, or at least recognize the Confederacy, now would be the time to do it if there was Confederate success in Maryland or Pennsylvania north of the Potomac River. So I think there very much was a possibility of Britain being able to come in and at least diplomatically recognize the Confederacy. Now, what aid they might have brought to the Confederate war effort could be argued, but the Confederacy receiving diplomatic recognition from a great chance would have been a tremendous boost to the Confederate war. It was a very real possibility in September 1862.
Another one of our audience tonight asks, did McClellan, did Halleck or Lincoln specifically order McClellan to pursue Lee toward the Potomac?
So what McClellan told them is basically he was trying to figure out where the army of Northern Virginia had gone. The only real strict pursuit orders that Lincoln gave to McClellan are what he says on September 15th after South Mountain, when McClellan is pursuing Lee towards the Potomac River. And Lincoln famously said, "Destroy the rebel army if possible," which does lead, he leaves some leeway there, if you will. Mm-hmm. The other pursuit orders that Lincoln gives, or at least really more suggestions, are in October 1862, following the Battle of Antietam. So there are no direct pursuit orders from Lincoln and Halleck in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Antietam. And it should be noted too, again, the bar Lincoln set for victory in this campaign was simply get Lee out of Maryland and back into Virginia.
Yeah, good point. All right, one last question here. After the war, did Lee admit any regrets from a military standpoint about the war?
Related more to the Maryland campaign as compared to the whole war, I wouldn't say necessarily a regret on Lee's part, but the lost orders was something that Lee and Confederate survivors, Confederate veterans after the war talked about pretty extensively. And a lot of the reasons they believed, many of these Confederate veterans believed the Maryland campaign was lost was because of the lost orders. And that's been one thing that has really, these veterans said it, then it's got to be true. And that's one thing that's really kept the story of the lost orders relevant, I think, is that a lot of these Confederate veterans were saying, if these lost orders had never been found, then Lee would have been more successful in Maryland than what he ultimately was.
All right, before we wrap up, Jen, I think we have one more slide to show about our future programming starting tomorrow. But first, Kevin Pawlak, thanks so much for being with us tonight. Excellent. I know we could have gone 2 hours. And I cut you short. I didn't give you as much a leash as you wanted or as much as I wanted to hear. But thanks so much.